Working in cooperation with members of the Pocono tribe, Dr. Weed began to develop the idea of creating a national heritage area encompassing 8 communities between Bristol and Providence, including here in East Providence, that would highlight the unique history of this area. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. David.
I was going to say good morning, but it's afternoon now, so it's very nice to see you all here. And I hear there's substantial interest in this topic, and given the conversations I've had so far this morning, I can understand there's a lot of interest in history here. And what I hope to do is to expand your historical horizon to go back about 100 years before colonial settlements took place here. So I'm going to tell the story of the Sowams Heritage Area and what really happened between the Massasoit and the Pilgrims here. Let me start with Sowams. You see this designation here. Sowams is the name of the southern area. Here's a map of the southern area that was occupied by the Pokanoket tribe. Okay. How many of you have heard of the name Pokanoket before today? Oh, good. Okay. We're making a major effort with the tribe to get people to be more familiar with that. How many people have heard of the name Wampanoag? Yeah, everybody's heard that because they've had about 100 years of publicity on it. So we're going to learn the distinction as we go along. You know you're in Sowams because you're not in Plymouth, 40 miles away, but you're at the home of the Massasoit. And one easy way to find that out is to go to downtown Warren, look at Town Hall, look above the door, and you will see a frieze or sculpture there that says Sowams 1621. I lived there for 40 years and never looked at that. And had I looked at that, I wouldn't have known what it was. That's the designation for the home of the Massasoit, Usamiquan, okay, who met the Pilgrims in March of 1621 and struck a treaty with them that guaranteed the peace between the English and the Native American indigenous inhabitants of southeastern Massachusetts that enabled the English to survive. Had that treaty not been struck, we probably wouldn't be here today, okay? And it's the treaty nobody knows anything about, right? Most people know of Usamiquan as this guy. This is the Cyrus Dallin sculpture down at Plymouth, overlooking Plymouth Harbor. And most people who go to Plymouth think that Usamiquan lived in Plymouth, okay? Nobody tells you that he lived 40 miles away, probably in, I like to say Warren. People who live in Barrington will say, well, it must have been Tyler Point in Barrington. And if depending on who you want to read, either Tom Bicknell or Virginia Baker, you'll get two different sites. It doesn't matter. What's really clear is that Usamiquan's home was right here, okay? And in order to meet with the Pilgrims to work out that treaty, he had to travel 40 miles. I first got involved in this because I live right behind Burrs Hill Park. Anybody been to Burrs Hill Park? Oh, good. If you go down to the town beach of the south end of Water Street, and look across the street, you will now see a historic marker there that I was able to work out with Todd Blount from Blount Fine Foods, who sponsored the marker. And now it explains what's going on at Burrs Hill, because that was the place where Usamiquan was buried when he died in 1661. Okay. Unfortunately, when the railroad came through in 1854, they began digging the gravel in that area. It wasn't a park at that time. It was just a sand and gravel pit. So the town librarian and amateur archaeologist by the name of Charles Carr decided that he'd better get what remains were in that area out of the park before they're all stolen. So he dug up 42 grave sites, including the grave site of Usamequan. And we have pretty good knowledge of that being his grave, because Virginia Baker reported that in one of the graves they found evidence of the lace on the sleeve of this red horseman's coat, and most importantly, this copper necklace in one of the graves. We know by clear reports by Ed Winslow in Mort's Relation, published in 1622, that horseman's coat and the copper chain necklace was given to Usamequan as a gift of friendship, and the copper chain necklace served as a marker that anytime he wanted to communicate with people in Plymouth, he would send a runner with the necklace, so that people in Plymouth knew that the message was coming from Usamequan and not one of his rivals. So a little bit of early espionage. Huh? So I didn't know anything about this. I lived right back behind the baseball field there, and one day 4 years ago, an excavator showed up in the park and started digging a hole. And I went over and said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "We're burying Usamequan and the contents of the 42 graves that were taken from here." And what had happened was that the Mashpee tribe on the Cape had organized an effort to get all of those items returned from the museums and placed them in a concrete vault in the ground and marked it with that monument that you can go see now. So what was taken from the grave has now been returned. And I said, I got to find out a lot more about this. What's going on here? So I've spent the last 4 years. Fortunately, I retired just at that time. You know how that goes. Lots of time on your hands. Okay. Well, I started working with a woman named Helen Jader, who had come up with this idea of a Sowams heritage area. How many of you are familiar with the Blackstone Valley Heritage Area? Anybody heard of that? Good. That's one of 55 heritage areas across the country. Okay. There's one in eastern Connecticut. There's one on the Hudson River, the Housatonic. There's one north of Boston, the Essex County. If you drive around, you will run into a heritage area. And what that is not a national park, but the National Park Service organizes these 55 heritage areas so that you will learn about the local history in places that aren't so familiar to you. And like the Blackstone, we would like to have a heritage area designated for Sowams, for the 8 communities from Providence down to Bristol, and including Swansea, Rehoboth, and Seekonk. More about that in a bit. So here we are. This is the same map that you see here, and what has always been known as Sowams. You see the designation Wampanoag there because people don't know their history. And this area was occupied and inhabited by people for approximately 10,000 years. We know that because prior to that time, there was 2 miles of ice with the glaciers here. So we knew that no one was living here then. But starting around that time, we have found all kinds of archaeological evidence of people living in these areas. And I assume that most of you live right nearby, correct? Okay. You moved here for a reason, right? Or grew up here, perhaps. Okay, somebody in your family moved here for a reason. The reason you moved here is just what we see outside here, right? Beautiful water, access to land, transportation, good farming back then. These were open fields, and a good opportunity for people to start their life. And that's what Europeans did once they discovered it. So when the English arrived, we began to encounter many other people. About 100,000 people were already living here. This idea that this was a vastly empty place only held true along the Atlantic coast. 1616, anybody remember that year? That was a terrible year if you had been living here for thousands of years, because at that point, some of the explorers brought with them contagious diseases. And in fact, about 90% of the population along the Atlantic coast was killed, wiped out. We get upset with our pandemic, but in proportion, we're talking, less than 1% of people who have succumbed to COVID. Back then, imagine 90% of your village dying, okay? Losing your elders, your warriors, your whole history, okay? It was an awful, awful event. And yet there was no record of it, because all we know is that there were people living here in large numbers. And then 3 years later, Squantum. You know about Squantum, right? That's Squanto. Had been captured prior to 1616, taken to Spain, enslaved. Then he managed to get his way into England, lived in London in the Cornhill section for a period of years, learned English, and then managed to get on a ship. He actually had 2 attempts. He went over, came back, didn't stay, and then came back again and traveled down from Maine back to his village of Patuxet, what we know as Plymouth today, only to find that everybody he knew there was dead. Okay? Imagine if that had happened to you. Okay? It was a horrible experience for him, but a fortunate experience for the English separatists, what we know as the Pilgrims, who traveled from England looking for a place that they could establish an area where they could worship as they pleased, unlike what was happening in England. So after 10 years in Leiden, they decided to come over and stay. And they found a virtually empty village ready for them to set up. Now, they weren't in very good shape either, and that half of them died by the following spring. But those who survived were able to meet with Usamequin, and both of them were experiencing problems. Usamequin had problems with people living on the other side of the bay, right over there, the Narragansetts, who very much wanted to move into this area because it was such a pleasant place to live. And they knew that Usamequin's warriors were decimated in the Great Dying 1616, 1619, so they were about to take advantage of that. So Usamequin said, the English have one thing that nobody has, guns. And that did the trick. They were able to ally with the English and keep the Narragansetts from moving into this area. That alliance lasted for over 50 years until Usamequin's death in 1661. And that really guaranteed the survival of the English. So after meeting, I always love this picture, this fanciful idea. You've all been to Cape Cod and Plymouth, and you know about the mountains in the background there, right? I don't know where these artists get these ideas. Anyway, here's the treaty, the substance of the treaty, 6 points, and basically it's a do no harm, we'll protect you. And also it guaranteed that they would take care of each other's problems within their own. So somebody on the English side did something that needed adjudication, punishment, the English would handle it, and the same on the Pokanoket side. And that was a good arrangement and lasted for a long time until more people moved into the area. Anybody seen this coin? It's a legitimate US dollar coin. It's on the back of the Sacagawea coin, okay? And not all of them have the treaty on the back. But this is the only time that the federal government has ever recognized this treaty. Probably the most important treaty in American history, and it gets no recognition, okay? You also notice that it's named Wampanoag, and that name didn't exist in 1621, more later. Ed Winslow, the Secretary of State for the Pilgrims, fascinating guy. He's the only one that ever had his portrait painted from that time period. This you can see at the Pilgrim Hall in Plymouth. But Winslow was not only a good diplomat, but he had been a printer in England and published many things before he came here. So fortunately, as soon as he got here, he started writing about what he was experiencing here and published books 2 years later in London. People were reading about what was going on in Plymouth because of Ed Winslow. Mort's Relation is probably the best known of those books, and it's a good read. And he gives a full description of what happened down here. In particular, he describes a meeting with Usamequin on July 3rd of 1621, where after the treaty was signed on April Fool's Day in 1621, the Governor Carver said, you need to go down and meet with Usamequin at his home. So Winslow traveled down here. It took 2 days to walk here, 42 miles, and met somewhere, we think in either, we like to say in Warren, but somewhere along the Warren River there was the village settlement where Usamequin was. And Winslow struck up a good friendship at that point in time, gave him the horseman's coat and copper chain necklace. And then came back 2 years later when he heard that Usamequin was deathly ill. In fact, heard reports on his travels down here that Usamequin had died, when in fact he hadn't. But he was in tough shape. He had some kind of disease, we don't know what. He was blind, he couldn't swallow, he was really on death's doorstep. So Winslow cooks up a little English concoction, some jelly and one thing or another. He wanted to give him chicken soup, but he had to order a chicken to be brought from Plymouth. It didn't arrive on time. But Usamequin recovers. And he says, Winslow, Keen Winslow. Actually, he would say Winslow because they didn't have an L in their language. We will be friends for life. And he meant it. And that sealed that friendship. And again, guaranteed, because not everybody under Usamequin was necessarily happy with the English arriving here. Corbitant, for one, in the Swansea area, was not happy, and he tried to ruffle some feathers and get the English out of here. But Usamequin won the day on that and kept to his agreement. So for that period of time, the English were able to survive without problems. Usamequin even warned them of a uprising that was coming from the Massasoit tribe, and Miles Standish and others went up and took care of that problem, cut his head off and one thing or another. So there was a lot of really interesting history that went on after that war. In school, what do you hear about? Oh, they met the Indians and had Thanksgiving, and that was it. And you never hear another word about the indigenous people here. Well, that's the most important part of the story, is what happened for those next 50 years. the area around his settlement was cleared land. I always thought when I started this that this area must have been full of virgin forest with, 6-foot oak trees and, the whole thing. No. People who lived here for at least 500 years were interested in growing corn. So they would clear fields and do that by fire twice a year and keep these open fields. So when Winslow arrived here, what he discovered was that Sowams, Osamequin's settlement, was surrounded by clear open fields. And if you're English and you just come over, what are you looking for? A place to grow your own crops and to raise your own animals, right? Of course, the native people never raised animals. They thought that was a crazy idea that you would feed an animal and then slaughter it. You go out and you hunt, and though they had crops, they had developed a kind of corn, maize, that would grow in the rocky New England soil, whereas the English were trying to grow their wheat and barley and having no luck at all. So they learned from the Poconokeets how to raise corn here. And you know the apocryphal story, right, of Squantum with the fish and all of that. Let me clue you in. It was probably the women who taught the pilgrims how to grow corn, because native women were in charge of the fields. Okay, they did the planting, not the men. Maybe Squantum did show one person, I don't know. So here's our buddy Miles Standish, who also came to this area and said, this is beautiful land. Let's purchase it. Let's move in. Okay, so in fact, for the next 40 years, that was what was going on. Bit by bit by bit, the land was being sold, and in 1653, you all know about the Wanamoyset marker here? How many people have been on Pawtucket Avenue? How many people have stopped at the Wanamoyset marker? Okay, you can barely see it. I drove by it this morning. It's there. Was it Silver Spring Golf Course there? Just north of there, on that side of the street, if you look at the stone fence along the sidewalk, there will be a tree and a large stone that's set back a little toward the golf course. And if you want to take your life in your hands and park somewhere, Wheeler Avenue is right across, you can park and then try to cross Pawtucket Avenue, good luck. Or park at the Silver Spring Golf Course and walk 50 yards, you'll find it. And I'm working with the town to get a decent historic interpretive marker there. But that was the town line between Sowams and Rehoboth, Rehoboth being the first purchase, an 8-by-8 mile section that was purchased in 1642 from Osamequin. And out of that came Newman Church. Just about the time of the Great Migration, when 1,000 people came over to Boston from England to settle north of here on vacated Massachusetts land because they also died. Roger had his problems. He had ideas that people didn't want to listen to, and they kicked him out of Plymouth after a couple of years. But while he was down here, he got to know Osamequin. And one thing that Roger was very skilled at was learning other languages. He had picked that up when he was in London working for his father, who was a cloth merchant. He would go down to the docks and negotiate the best price for cloth that was coming in from India and other parts of the world by speaking to the crew in their language. Okay? So he had a deal before the captain ever got off the ship. Okay, he was very good at picking up languages, and in fact, he wrote Key into the Languages of America. Okay, good book if you want to pick that up and read what he wrote about the Algonquin language here. It's fascinating. Roger goes up to Salem thinking he can do okay there, and they didn't like what he had to say, and the authorities in Boston said, "We're sending you back to England." So he gets word of this in January of 1636 and decides he's not going to stick around to be taken back to England. He walks down here to meet with his buddy, Osamequin. Worst winter of that time, 3-foot snow, terrible cold, the bay had frozen over, bad time to be making a 60-mile trip on foot. But somehow he made it down here on death's door. Osamequin and his warriors found him, took him to a place called Margaret's Cave, which is right there, which is in Swansea, and a native woman who they called Margaret, it was probably an Algonquin name that they couldn't pronounce, took care of him. And we've realized recently that Margaret's Cave wasn't out in the woods. You wouldn't take a friend who was sick and put him in the woods to recover. You take him to your winter settlement. So we commissioned an artist to do a painting of the winter settlement at Margaret's Rock, because we believe that's what was going on there at the time, and that's where Roger recovered. He writes very briefly about spending 14 weeks there, recovers well enough that Osamequin says, I know where you can go for your settlement. We'll send you up to Omega Pond. Okay, it wasn't a pond then, it was part of the Seekonk River, but there was a spring there. And I also believe that there were native people living there as well. I mean, if you have fresh water close to salt water, that's where you want to live. So Roger goes up there, sends for his family from Salem, starts planting his corn, and is all ready to build a home and live there. And he gets word from Ed Winslow, you got to get out of here. This is Plymouth territory. So he makes the apocryphal trip across the Seekonk River, meets Canonicus, the Narragansett chief over there. What cheer, Neetop? You know, look on any of the Providence DPW trucks. What cheer, Neetop? Okay, just basically saying hello, Englishmen. And he was given property to settle on, but notice that it was on the east side of the Massasoit River, because Canonicus didn't really own that area. That was still Osamequin's land, okay? All very interesting, but that settlement, which we know today as Providence, became Roger's home. But not too long ago, not too long after that, other people in East Providence began moving in, and in particular, that's Omega Pond. Has anybody been to the Roger Williams Memorial there that spring? Have you? Good. You're the first person I've found who's ever been there. It's off of Roger Williams Avenue, across from the pond there, but it's set so far back, if you didn't know it was there, you'd go right by it, okay? We're going to get a historic marker there. I've been talking with the planning department about that. And the Daggett House just down the street, 1690 or so. So there's plenty of evidence of some of the early houses there. Philip Walker House, they're working on getting that open soon. So East Providence is full of terrific places. People need to know about this. The Newman Church is obviously not the church that was there 400 years ago, but this is the fourth building they've had. But they were started in 1643 when Samuel Newman brought members of his congregation down from Weymouth. Weymouth had been an early English settlement, but things were not going so well there for all kinds of reasons. Read about Wassagusset sometime. So he comes down, settles that area, builds a whole ring of houses called the Ring of the Green around the center there. If you take the map of the houses that were settled around the Newman Church and place it over today's map, this is what you get. And I was shocked when I did that. I found out it fit perfectly. And what the arrangement was is that you have the church in the center, then a common green in the middle, and everybody had there were 5 gates that you could bring your animals into the green at night, and you paid somebody to stay overnight and keep the wolves away, okay? But on the other end of your property, you had access to water, okay? With the 10-mile river on one side, with the Seacock River on the other, and then you had a woodlot. So what a deal. I mean, you know, if I were selling Florida real estate, I'd be interested in moving up here to see what I could sell as well. And people were quite happy with that, and there were other people who moved into the area. And you've all been to Hunts Mills, I hope. Go over there and, you know, not only to see the falls, but that's 1643 was the first mill there. So they were able to grind their corn and eventually manufacture their fabric and things of that sort. It's a fabulous place, and again, one that the Poconokeets knew well. That river was very important to them. Today, in Providence, all you're going to find is the Roger Williams Memorial. As far as I know, there are no buildings prior to 1700 in Providence. You can find the Waypossid Bridge at the bottom of College Hill. That's the 8th bridge that's been at that spot, but that spot has not changed since Roger Williams' time. When they first built the bridge across that neck there, that was the only place you could get from West Bay to East Bay, you know, without drowning, without swimming. On low tide, you could still drive your cattle across there. They eventually built a bridge, and Roger was the toll taker at the bridge. Got to make a living somehow, you know. So we have that bridge. We have the memorial, which claims to have the spring, but it's not real clear. The bottom is of an artist's depiction of what early Providence would have looked like. And not far from there is the rest of Rehoboth. Most people don't go to Rehoboth. I never went to Rehoboth because every time I went there, I'd get lost. It's very difficult. Rehoboth used to be clear. You had cleared land, and you could see everywhere. But people stopped clearing the land 50 years ago, and guess what happens? All the trees started growing up, and now it's like going through tunnels. Thank God for GPS. But the rest of Rehoboth was settled at that time. You remember that the East Providence was Rehoboth originally, and then split to Seacock, and then that split to East Providence and Seacock. Very interesting history. And that Daggett house that you saw earlier was in 2 cities and 3 states without ever moving. And you'll find a few markers around Rehoboth for some of the block houses they had there. But other than, how about the Carpenter Museum? Anybody here been to the Carpenter Museum? Oh, good. It's a nice little museum, but they don't have enough money to keep it open more than a couple afternoons a week. Good displays in there, and there's even a kettle in there that supposedly King Philip Usamequin's son owned during the war. There's a picture of it on one of the guides over there. So you have all these English people settled all around here, land being sold north, south, all the way down to Newport, settlements along the western shore over here. Roger kept a trading post down at Smith's Castle, if you've been down there. That was his trading post. He went back and forth there all the time, made money by selling furs and trading. But as you begin to see, the tribe was basically reduced to the peninsula for Bristol, Tecumseh, okay? This was the only land that was never sold, and it remained the place where the Poconoket tribe resided up until 1675. Their numbers were diminishing. The English numbers were exploding. By the time of the King Philip War, there were, we estimate, only about 700 of them left on the peninsula. Meanwhile, there were about 50,000 Europeans in the area. Imagine, okay? When you see your culture, your language, your whole history disappearing, and this was your land forever, but you've been invaded, what do you think about doing? War, right? And just like we're seeing in right now, when people who have a homeland are invaded, they fight back. And that's what Osamequin's son, it's actually his second son, Metacomet, who got himself renamed King Philip, because he was in charge of a whole country. And if the English had a king, he should be king. That's why they called him King Philip. They picked the name for him because Philip was not a Christian, and they didn't want to give him a Christian name because he didn't have any interest in becoming a Christian. So here we have somebody who was still governing a whole kingdom and had been invaded over a 50-year period of time. So he allied with the Nipmucs, eventually the Narragansetts, and several other tribes in an effort to drive the English back to England, or at least out of the way, okay? And that turned into one of the most devastating war in North America. The percentage of people killed in that war was much higher than any other war, and yet we don't tell anybody about it, okay? The King Philip War is the most significant turning point in this whole story, because that's when the power and the control over the land shifted from indigenous to colonial and never went back. So that war only lasted 14 months. It looked, after the first 3 or 4 months, like the alliance, the Native Alliance, was going to win, but they began running out of food and ammunition in the next spring. And then, who's related to Benjamin Church? There you go. Benjamin, who was very friendly with the native people over in Sakonnet, got some other native people to work on his side, and he adopted a different style of warfare. The British were used to just lining up and standing still and firing, all on command. What he learned was how to do guerrilla warfare, and that's what turned the war. And they were finally able to subdue King Philip's troops, and Philip himself was finally shot by a native man with Church's gun misfired down at the Miry Swamp on Mount Hope farmland. If you've ever been down there, the spot's still there, and you can go and visit it. But that ended the war and ended the dominance of the Poconokeets, who had been here for 10,000 years. I mean, it was almost the end of their culture. We have some markers today of the war itself. The war broke out in the place in what's now in Swansea, called the Miles Garrison. It's just a stone marker. That building to the left is not the original Garrison house, but it's a house that was built on that site. And then below is the marker where Philip was shot and killed and quartered, and his head put on a pike and taken to Plymouth, where it remained for 20 years outside of the Plymouth as a warning. Don't ever do this again. Today you can find some evidence of what the land around here was like if you look. Some of the land, like in Sowams Woods in Barrington, I don't know if you've ever been, there's a beautiful spot. There's a whole lake that you can walk around there. And then some of the pathways, this one down on the lower right is Waypossid Preserve in Bristol, Again, something that most people don't know about. If you go to the Narrows down in Bristol, you will go right by it. It'll be on your left. And it's open public land, and there are trails through there. And you can get some idea of what life might have been like 400 years ago. A couple of other places that are my favorites are along Market Street in Warren. If you know where Tim Johnson's Market is there, just go a little bit south and you will find the rock on the right, which is King's Rock. And that flat portion on top has a groove down the middle of it, and that was where Native women would grind corn and roll a stone across there. Across the street, there's what I believe to be a ceremonial rock. That's the archaeologists will tell you that's a glacial erratic, but yes, glacial erratics don't arrange themselves on top of granite outcroppings and prop themselves up with little stones underneath, okay? Now that was put there for a reason, and one of the reasons was that was known as Sacham's Knoll. That's the place I was talking earlier about, how from that place in Swansea, you can see the blades of the Allens Avenue turbines, okay, naked eye, okay, because it's on a knoll. And Native people were always known to revere high places like Mount Hope and Bristol, and a place for signal fires. You can also go up to Newtoconachet Hill in Providence. Anybody been there? I never heard of it. Good. Western boundary of Providence. 300 feet high. You can see the whole city down below. There's a beautiful park there. Yeah, it's very nice. Well, the Native people from 4 tribes used to meet there. The Nipmucks, the Massachusetts, the Narragansetts, and the Poconokeets would hold their tribal councils there. So that was, again, a significant high place. And then Mount Hope in Bristol, which Brown University won't let you near right now. We need to change that. And then Abrams Rock behind Town Hall in Swansea. That's the evidence of Native people, okay, is stone of markers, places of significance. They did not build buildings. That wasn't their way of life. But if you know what stones to look for, what rock outcroppings, you can begin to get a sense of what was important to them. A little bit like the Acropolis, remember? That was just a big stone outcropping. Archaeological digs all over the place. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but there's a terrific article. I brought one copy here, and it's online on my website, with all the different digs around here, places that we found plenty of evidence of people living here for at least 7,000 or 8,000 years. And you might recognize the location in the upper left. It's right down there. We believe that there have been a number of digs right along in this area here. More than likely, there were people living here, as there were. Anytime you get access to salt water and you have fresh water nearby, and there are springs around here, then you had people living there. Maybe not permanently, maybe periodically, but the chances are very good that if you were to dig anywhere here, you have to go down 2-3 feet, okay, because there's that much soil that's been layered on over the years, but you will find evidence of people having lived here. Just to finish up, as far as the English, you can go down in Bristol. If you ever drive down Hope Street into Bristol, just as you're coming into the town, well, Sip and Dip is there. Okay, you'll see a house, that house up at the top there, 1680, first house in Bristol. I thought it was a joke when I saw that sign on the corner there. No, that's the house. The wood for that house was brought over from England, and they needed to build a house for a pastor. You couldn't have a town without a church. You couldn't have a church without a pastor. You couldn't have a pastor without a parsonage. So you build a parsonage, get a pastor, get a church, get a meeting house. Now you're a town, and that's how Bristol started. okay, as did any other town around here. Few other places in Bristol that, the only 3 places in Bristol that have pre-1700 structures. I won't go into detail about that. The other 17th century houses, there are only a dozen 17th century houses in these 8 towns. John Martin House over in Barrington, that's the Hale Noon's Farm as you come in on Market Street in Warren. John Martin House over in Swansea, if you get a chance, go over there. It says 1720, but we think the foundation actually predated 1700. And it's a good place to get it. It's the only place around here where you can go inside a house that looked pretty much like it did when the English settlers were here. And they have some great collections. The Kingsley House over in Rehoboth, and then the William Hunt House over in Seekonk. So there are a few remnants of that time. But mostly what you can do is come over to Warren and stop at the monument for Usamequin, and maybe learn a little bit about the Pokanoket people who are still here. We started just this last August 8th, in celebration of International Indigenous Peoples Day, otherwise known as Victory Day in Rhode Island. Every year we will have a celebration where you can come and learn about the Pokanoket culture, because they haven't disappeared. They had to go into hiding. They were outlawed for centuries, couldn't speak their language, couldn't self-identify. At first they started calling themselves Wampanoag. But Wampanoag was a name that was given by Cotton Mather during the King Philip War to describe the native tribes who had allied with Philip in the King Philip War. It was the name of the enemy, if you were English, okay, was Wampanoag, just meant Easterner. There was never a Wampanoag tribe, didn't ever exist. The Wampanoag Federation didn't form until 1927, when they brought people together in Mashpee who had been given land because they fought on the side of the English. So unfortunately, they adopted the name of the enemy. I don't understand that, but they will tell you up and down that the Wampanoags were the first people here. Read any history book, look at any map. The earliest map of this area was 1675, John Seller over in England, who published a map, and it says very clearly, Pokanoket, King Philip country on the map. There is no Wampanoag anywhere on that map, okay? So now you will walk out of here knowing it's Pokanoket, not Wampanoag. Maybe we'll get the Wampanoag Trail name changed sometime to Pokanoket. But I work with the tribe, and they're very anxious to help people learn about them. We were able to publish a booklet last year. This is all about the Pokanoket tribe and their history. We've gotten the town of Warren to do a land acknowledgement so that people in Warren know who the first people were there. And then Barrington followed up in December. And now we're working on East Providence. And Nate Cahoon is going to introduce some legislation in City Hall. So we'll have the Pokanokets recognized as the first people of the East Bay. I'd be happy to take questions and anything you want to learn about the Sowams Heritage Area that you're a part of. Okay, you've got a map in your brochure there. There's a whole website over, I think I'm up to 388 pages on that, but you won't see them all when you first open it up, but lots of detail in terms of what's around here, those 53 locations and all kinds of events that have taken place. And presentations like this one, which will be on the website. And so this is all part of our effort to educate people and to move in the direction of establishing a national heritage area. So you won't be the only ones who know this history, that we want everybody across the whole country and around the world to know what really happened between the Massasoit and the Pilgrims, and where it took place, right under your feet. So, questions?
What people or tribes were, say, over in Tiverton or in Middleton?
Yeah,
or
you're talking the Pocasset. The Sakonets do not exist anymore. They were wiped out. And though there's a history there, there's no tribe. But the Pocasset tribe is alive and well, and they're very eager to talk about their history. They're based, they have reservation land in Fall River on the east side of the North Watuppa Pond over there. So unlike the Poconokeets, who have no land and who are anxious to get Brown University to give up Mount Hope and return that to them. Good luck. Well, if any of you can help us with that, please let me know, okay? They actually have an agreement, a written agreement to return that, and they're working right now on a trust arrangements for that. So we're very hopeful it'll happen, but it may take some political pressure to get them to move. They've had Brown University got the Heffenreffer property given to them in 1953 because Rudolph was collecting stuff, and he set up that museum that was there. Some of you may have visited that. Well, Brown moves in and starts putting all their anthropological collection there, over 1 million items there. Terrible location, okay? If you've been there, it's a big barn. That's not where you put archival material, okay? They've done the best they can with that, but they got a grant from the Mellon Foundation 3 years ago to move everything from there to downtown Providence, and they're in the process of doing that. So they will be vacating that property shortly. So there's no reason for Brown to hold on to that. And it should go back to the ancestral people. That's sacred land for them.